Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. As you may notice, I am not Jim McKeith. It's Ian Barker here, Embarcadero MVP. Jim, unfortunately, couldn't make it today, so things are going to be a little bit up in the air. So I apologise if things don't go silky smooth like they do normally. Today's webinar is about powering the web with Delphi. The webinar that we've got has got a series of videos showing various frameworks, shall we say, that work with Delphi and RAD Studio. The ones in particular we're showing today are TMS Web Core and IntraWeb 17, which is the new version of IntraWeb, and also IntraWeb 15 is going to be discussed as well. There's a series of videos that are chained together. After the videos, we'll take some questions. If I just explain who is on the line, which we'll introduce a little bit later at the end of the videos. Today with us, apart from myself, is Bruno Fierens from TMS. We have Dr. Holger Flick, who is an Embarcadero MVP, and also the TMS evangelist, and Chad Hauer from A to Z Software. He is responsible for IntraWeb in general and some other rather good products as well. The questions will be answered as we go along, so feel free to answer questions. I noticed we've already got someone saying good morning from Colombia. Hello, Javier from Colombia. We'll try and answer as many questions as we can as we go along during the video. And at the end of it, we will actually read some of those questions back. Usually what happens with these kind of web-based webinars is we get an absolute flood of messages and can't keep up. I'm hoping today is no different and that we keep up with them a little bit better, but feel free to answer as many questions as you like. But for now, we're going to try and go over to the video. This is the first time that April, who's very capably driving at the other end, has done this. So forgive us if we take a few goes at this, but we will get there. So over to you, April, for the video.
Welcome to Powering the Web with Delphi. This session is divided into several sections, and I'm going to introduce you to TMS Web Core so that you will power the web and Delphi using TMS Web Core. My name is Holger Flick and I'm the Chief Evangelist of TMS Software. At the end of the session, I'll try to answer all your questions and I'll get support from our CEO and CTO, Bruno Fierens. The most common problem is to find the right tool to get the job done. And as the session says, we want to develop applications or client applications for the web. So let's think about what you as a Delphi developer are looking for. You're looking for rapid application development for web client applications. And also you want to fulfill the requirements that you have an object-oriented programming language like Delphi, that you still can use rapid application development principles like the component-based approach, and that you have a ready-to-use toolkit at your side that you can quickly build user interfaces with the controls given in that toolkit, that you have access to web services of any kind, be it XML, JSON, and also that you've already pre-built components that you can use for popular cloud services like Google Drive, Google Maps, Microsoft Azure, and so on. For the web, there's a lot of JavaScript out there. JavaScript frameworks and libraries should be easy to integrate into your solution. Finally, deployment is always an issue because if you consider development time, most of the time you forget the time for deployment and it has to be quicker than expected. So Xcopy deployment, meaning you just copy the files onto web server, is preferred. At this stage, I can tell you to look no farther because TMS Web Core is your solution that fulfills all those criteria. In addition to the list that I just presented, TMS Web Core integrates into the IDE, the Integrated Development Environment of RAD Studio or Delphi. You can also use the rapid application development approach with forms and frames and dozens of visual and non-visual controls. As programming language, of course, you use Delphi or Object Pascal. The web development framework is called TMS Web Core. The base of each web client application are pages, or in Delphi terminology, forms. With TMS Web Core, you have multiple options how to build your pages. The rapid application development approach is exactly as you're used to it from Delphi. You have a tool palette with components, and you drop these components or controls on your form. You compile the project, run the project, and you get your running application in the web. Here on the slide you see the controls that are on a form in the Delphi form designer, and on the right you see the running web client application in the Chrome web browser. Just as you're used to from building desktop applications, you can double-click on the button and implement the source code. What happens if the button is clicked? You have other events that you're used to, like on change and so on. Just as with desktop applications, you have the same or similar set of events and methods available to make changes or react to user interaction. TMS Web Core is heavily based on the VCL when it comes to the user controls. For example, this button is called TWeb button and also has an on-click, on-double-click event, and it has a caption property, a name property, and so on. Obviously, a Delphi desktop application does not look like modern web pages. For this purpose, you can select a mixed approach. You can add style sheets and additional HTML to your forms and integrate your form that you designed in the Delphi form designer into this layout. Here you see on the left side the very same form from the previous slide, but the form is integrated and styled using cascading style sheets, but it is also integrated into a template. So you see that with TMS Web Core, you have a strict separation of HTML, CSS, and your application logic and the form design in the Delphi form designer. The final option is to only use the Delphi form designer to interact with the controls that you use inside of your page and use a template that is purely based on web design. You have the option, for example, to download any of these templates that you see on this slide from creativetim.com and then integrate your form into this template. TMS Web Core makes it easy that you can concentrate on the application logic because you can use Delphi and known Delphi events and Delphi methods that you've known for years. And also legacy source code can immediately be used on the web. Before I show you a couple of examples for the form design, let me also tell you what kind of application types are available. First of all, we have the classic web client application. That is a normal web application that you would call a web page. It is separated from an installable mobile application for iOS and Android, a so-called progressive web application. These kinds of applications have become known through Google, and they have the characteristic that they actually download on your mobile device, and nowadays they also download on your desktop browser. That means if you get disconnected from the internet, you can still use these mobile applications on your device, and that remedies one of the major downsides of web client applications because sometimes being connected to the internet is just not possible. TMS Web Core offers installable desktop applications through the Electron framework. You build a web application and the framework converts them to desktop applications for Windows, macOS, and Linux. Just be aware, in order to create a macOS application, you actually need a Mac computer, and this is a restriction from Apple and not from TMS Web Core. However, on the Windows platform, you can create binaries for Linux. So without further ado, let's have a look at some examples that have been created with TMS Web Core. This is Delphi 10.4 Sydney with the latest release of TMS Web Core installed. Creating a web application is easy because it integrates completely into the Delphi IDE. So using File, New, Other, go into TMS Web, you get all the different application types that are available. Let's simply create a TMS Web application, click OK, and everything will be set up for you. Inside of every web application with TMS Web Core, you'll find the landing page. Normally you rename this to index.html, and you get the different forms as Pascal units. Each Pascal unit not only has the DFM file, but also the HTML file for additional design elements that you want to express with style sheets, CSS style sheets, and HTML. You have components and controls to link this HTML to the form designer. As mentioned in the tool palette, you find dozens of controls that are ready and come with a product. Just to give you an example for the web application development, we drop an edit control, a button, we change the caption of the button to time exclamation mark, change the name of the web edit to txt time, change the text to nothing, and you see the property names are the property names that you're used to from the VCL, and we change the name of the button to button time. And then you have all the events. Let me expand this a little bit bigger. You have all the events that you're used to. For the button you have on click, for the edit control you have on change, on double click, on click, and also more sophisticated events like on enter, on exit, key down, and so on. Double clicking on the control also opens the implementation, and as you can see, this is Delphi code. And in order to show the time, we say text time dot, we have full code completion, text equals date time to string. So the regular runtime functions and procedures are also available now, and that's it. This looks pretty much like a VCL application, but as you see now, if I click run, my web browser will be launched and the application will start inside of the web. So clicking the button would show us the current time with the date, of course. With regards to deploying the app, you'll end up with the HTML file, which could be index.html, the actual application, which becomes a JavaScript application, and your form, which is unit 1. And you can see it right here. Unit 1 becomes unit 1 HTML, and the project becomes JavaScript and the project HTML. So these are the 3 files that you have to deploy to the web server, and this will give you additional debug information in case you want to debug on your web server. Time is rather short in this session. I just showed you the example for the form design just using controls, no HTML at all. And let's pick the one where you use the Delphi form designer primarily, but add a couple of HTML and cascading style sheets. Included in the TMS Web Core package is the Bootstrap example. You find it in the demo folder, in the basics folder, and then the next directory is called Bootstrap. Here you see that all the controls can be mapped to standard controls like tweb edit, tweb button. You've seen them both in action already. And then here we have a tweb memo, which behaves similar to a memo. And here we have the tweb combo box, again, very similar to the VCL combo box, and a label. What is new in this example is the fact that these controls are actually mapped to element class names, so to CSS classes. And if you look at the Bootstrap framework, you find out that the form control class is used for edits and for other elements of forms, and buttons, for example, always get the button class, and button primary means it's a primary button. If you press enter, it is also being executed. You would call it in the VCL the default button. Let's run this. You see that the corners are round, and as soon as you switch between the different elements, they are highlighted with zero work. You just use what is being provided by the cascading style sheet or the JavaScript library, Bootstrap in this case. Let's add a couple of numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and there you go. So the numbers are added to the memo. And if you look at the implementation as a VCL developer, you could have written that yourself. You basically say combo box items add the text of the web edit, and the same thing you do for the web memo. You add to the lines of the web memo the text of the web edit, and that's it. So there's really nothing very special about it. The only difference is that you need to learn the different classes from the style that you want to use. This can also be a company-specific style. This doesn't have to be Bootstrap or something that is open to the public. This can be a very specific style that is used inside of your organization. And also, in addition to the style sheet elements, you can also add additional HTML, as you've seen in this example. Finally, The best way to do design as a developer is if you ask a professional web designer to do the design for you. And TMS Web Core makes it really easy to integrate your application into that existing design. Here you see the working application with a template that we downloaded from CreativeTem. This template even offers a responsive design, meaning it adapts to the size of the device that is being used on. For example, if you open this page on an iPhone, you wouldn't see this left menu bar. It would be collapsed, as you can see here. This is where the menu is. And if you make it wider again, the form changes its appearance completely. This is all integrated in the HTML template. This is nothing you have to do. If you see the application now, what it looks like in the form designer, you'll be surprised. You only focus on the controls that your application has to deal with. In this case, the order number and the order date, and of course the control, the button to execute a search. If you compare this with the resulting application, you really could focus on the elements here and didn't have to do any of the colors of the fonts. It's all done by the web designer. And you might ask yourself, how is this all done? Well, TMS Web Core makes it easy to link your design to the source code. First of all, and there's tutorials and videos available, there's control binding, which looks what is included inside of the HTML file, what is included inside of my form, and you can map it to each other. Also available is control sync, which will create controls inside of your Delphi form designer for elements that the web designer has designed. For example, if you get a form from a web designer, these controls will be created for you automatically inside of the Delphi form designer. And also the link will be set up, meaning if you make changes in your source code to that element inside of the template will of course also be affected. But don't worry, your application will not be just something that adds to the HTML or CSS. You can also use frames to define your menu as it is shown here. And then you also have the so-called web element action list, where you can define actions for elements that you can find inside of an HTML template. So TMS Web Core makes it really easy to use existing templates, existing web pages, and add application logic to that. We all know that we're good Delphi developers, but the web design should be done most of the time by professional web designers. And TMS Web Core makes this communication or cooperation very easy. If you want to learn more about TMS Web Core, there's multiple references available. First of all, the documentation with more than 500 pages, plenty of tutorial videos and blog posts on the TMS software webpage. There is a training course by Wagner Landgraf and also our Brazilian partners. And from my side, I wrote a book in German and English language called TMS Web Core, Web Application Development with Delphi, and it's available worldwide on Amazon.com as a paperback. This is the starting URL to find all what I just mentioned, web.tmssoftware.com. Finally, Bruno Ferenc and I will be joining the roundtable that is available as part of this session. We're eagerly awaiting your questions and will be happily answering as many questions as we can get in. Thank you for watching.
Anyone familiar with IntraWeb should be familiar with our famous guest demo, which dates back to at least 1996. While the guest demo is very simplistic, it is purposeful. Its purpose is both as a basic reference demo, but also to introduce developers to IntraWeb without complexity. That being said, Guest has never been completely bare and has always demonstrated several core features for those who dig into it. I will not dig into all aspects of IntraWeb 17 here. For deeper coverage of the designer, IWML, and other aspects, please check out the other videos or sections we have done on these. One thing I'll repeat about the designer is that the designer is a preview designer, and while we feel it is pretty amazing, there will be a lot more improvements before its final release. For IntraWeb 17, we have created an IntraWeb 17 specific version of Guess. Let's dig into it. This is the beta designer for IntraWeb 17. This time we've used jQuery UI accordions to group information about the Guest demo. As it is truly a what you see is what you get designer, many of the elements are live at design time. Let's take a look at the server code. The code is all very straightforward, but there is something very important here that is new to IntraWeb 17. We could have easily used simple fields as seen in the private section of the page class to store the count and magic number. This is how guess in IntraWeb 15 works. Note that instead of simply using fields, we have also created published properties. This is not required, but doing so lets us use a new feature of IntraWeb 17. Published properties on a page create two-way values that are automatically synchronized between the front and the back end. This allows JavaScript in the browser to not only read these values, but also change them, and the changed values will be visible by the back-end server code as well. Guess uses these properties in two areas. For the label showing the guess count, IntraWeb Markdown is combined with data binding to display the number of guesses. This code executes on the front end in the browser. When we run this, it will display the guess count without needing additional code to update the label. Markdown can also be used to apply textual styles, insert links, bind to data, or fill in user-defined functionality. For the Go button, we have defined both front-end and back-end events. Front-end events are written in JavaScript. In this example, we do some front-end validation of the input to avoid extra server calls. We also allow the user to find out what the magic number was, but also change it to 22. This is done by holding down the Shift key while clicking the Go button. When this happens, the magic number is displayed but also changed to 22 in the front-end code. Because the value is automatically synchronized between the front-end and back-end, the server code will also see a value of 22. When both a front-end and back-end event are defined, normally only the front-end code will execute and override the back-end Delphi event. However, if you want both to be called, simply make a call to the call server event method. It is done this way to allow the front-end code to decide not only if to call the back-end event, but when. By allowing to control when it is called, front-end code can be executed both before or after, or before and after the back-end code, allowing complex scenarios to be handled with ease. Let's take a look at it running. Here are the jQuery UI accordions. Let's make a few guesses. And now let's activate the cheat with the Shift key. Let me show you how easy it is to use REST with IntraWeb 17. First, we need to add a data source. For the URL, I'm inserting an online REST data source. Now let's create a simple page. The designer is still in development, so you may notice a few glitches along the way. The buttons will move the client data cursor forward and backward using the client events. The buttons are enabled and disabled automatically by binding the enabled property to the properties of the client-side cursor. For Table 1, I will set the data source to the data source we created earlier and customize a few properties. For text 1, I am binding the text property directly. For text 2, I am using Markdown with an embedded binding to bind the data. For text 3, I am using Markdown again, but binding the properties of the cursor to display the current and maximum record count. And here we have one of the beta designer glitches. The designer normally refreshes as properties are changed, but sometimes it loses the connection. To bypass this, let me close and reopen the designer. With the designer reopened, you can now see the property changes are applied. Even the data is live at design time. Now let's run the demo. Notice we have not written any code at all. Notice that the back button is disabled. This was done automatically by our binding in the enabled property of the button. We can navigate the data, and all the bound properties are updated as we move through the client-side data. Now that I've shown how easy it is to connect to an existing REST server, let me show you how to do the same with a T dataset. For simplicity, I will use a T client dataset, but any T dataset is usable. Instead of dragging and dropping non-visual components, we use the Add Component option. For the data, I will load the data from a simple XML file and use the in-memory function of the T dataset. The data in the XML file is different from the external REST URL, but has the same schema, so we don't need to update any of the bindings. Now I need to change the IntraWeb data source to use our T dataset instead of the external REST URL. Let's run it to see the changes. Data binding isn't limited to read-only, and two-way bindings are fully supported. To see this, let me change the text 1 from a text control to an edit control. This is most easily done by simply editing the IWML. When I open the designer again, you see that text 1 is now an edit control. In order for any changes to be posted back to our server-side T dataset, we will need some sort of server event. I will convert the next button into a server-side event that updates text 2 to say OK. This allows IntraWeb to post the changed data back into the VCLT dataset. In this event, I modify the text property, which will be reflected in the browser. I'm changing Mickey to Minnie. When I click the next button, it triggers a call to the server and will update the appropriate row in the T dataset. Changes are not limited to a single row, and changes to any fields in any rows of the data will be batched and updated to the server when a server event is called. All this was done transparently by IntraWeb, and I did not have to write a single line of server code to accomplish any of it. One of the biggest concerns with IntraWeb 17 that users have expressed with us is how compatible it will be, because they see all the new controls and the capabilities and they wonder if it's going to introduce big breaking changes in their applications. And the good news is it will not break anything. In fact, the way that 17 integrates, it integrates as an add-on to the existing 15 base. It introduces a new page type. So when you're building your applications, you can create a type 15 page or a type 17 page, and you can mix and match as many of these pages as you want in a single application. They will always share the same session, and all of the server features available in 15 are also available in 17. Now the demo I'm going to show you soon is a pretty simplistic demo with only 2 pages, but you can add as many pages as you want and go back and forth seamlessly, even sharing data sets between 15 and 17 pages, which I'm also going to show. Now, before we get to that, this is the preview designer. This is part of the reason for the major delay in IntraWeb 17. The original IntraWeb 17 plan was to not have a designer and just have the runtime code, and you would have had to edit IWML, and the feedback we got was that we really needed to spend the time on the designer. So we've embarked on the designer, and this has introduced, of course, quite a delay into the original timeline. But as you can see here, the designer is pretty advanced. But even the designer itself, when release 17, will be a preview designer. It'll be fully functional, but the runtime will be a release code. So for example, what will you get in the preview? For example, when you add controls, you have to find them. You can search them, but you have to add them by looking up just their names. This is similar to the tool palette in Delphi. You don't really get the preview, but you will in the future. But you can see that I can interact directly with things, and this is one that was based on a Bootstrap template. But let's move on to show you how it integrates directly between the two. So for example, here I have IntraWeb 15. This is the runtime package and the design time package, and I also have IntraWeb 17, and these are both loaded and running at the same time. And the 17 packages depend directly on the 15 packages. They can't run without them. Now when we release 17, they'll probably be reduced down to a single package, but you can see here that it's based on the same code, and this is why it's highly compatible. So what I'm going to do here is show you my one of the demos here called data, and I already have the pages here. This one, for example, is a 17 page. When you click on it, you can see here the design class is a T17 page, and this one is a TIW app form, which is a type 15 page. Now when I add new pages, you'll see here we have the existing 15 types. We also have, if I want to add a 17 page, I just select that. Now that I have these, let's take a quick look at them. So here's the 17 page, and this is part of the temporary designer. Just click on this, and then you get what you see is what you get designer. And what's pretty cool is even though this is an actual designer and I can edit things, for example, if I want to change this to say edit me, now it'll say edit me. But some things I can preview live, even though I'm not actually running the application. I can change the number of rows I want to see. Let's resize it a little bit wider. I can do searching. So there's some pretty neat stuff you can do. And what's neat about this too is you can run not only server-side code. For example, the edit me button, if we come over here, you'll see it has a server click event. So let's take a look at the code. Here's the code for it. So that's the server side, and it just gets the selected key from the table, which is selected on the client side but automatically communicated back to the server side. And then this right here creates and shows the 15 page. Now let's go back over here for a second. Okay, now the next button, in this one we don't execute server side, and you can actually execute both client and server, but in this case I'm going to execute just server side code, just client side code, so we don't have to hit the server time just to move to the next record. So we insert this line of code here, and if I have multiple lines I can open an editor here by clicking this, but in a lot of cases, as here, I just have one line. I'm just going to move it to the next record. Now this is a client side move, but what's neat about this is this table is bound to a data source, which is on my user session, which I'm using like a data module, and that single data source is shared by both the 15 and the 17 application. So if I edit it in the 15 page, it'll show up in the 17 pages change, and we're going to show that as well. Now these ones up here have data binding, but they have a new form of data binding. They're not using server-side binding, they're using client-side binding. I can bind any property. For example, if I wanted to bind the text property, I could come up to bindings and I could bind the text property here, and if it was an input control such as an edit box, it would be a two-way binding, but this is a label, so of course there's no input, so it's one way. But in this case, I didn't want to use two labels. I wanted to use one label. So in the text property, what I did is I used what's called IntraWeb 17 Markdown. And I put the text I wanted to see. And then inside square brackets, I put a binding expression. Now this Markdown can be used for formatting as well. You can use it to create in-text links, styles such as bold, italics, those sorts of things. But you can also do one-way data binding within a Markdown expression. So in this case, I put equals users, which is the data set I'm binding to, and name field. So it'll put it right here, and you can see even at design time I'm still getting that binding. And where that comes from is if I select a page, each page has a list of data sources. So this one has one called users, and the users I can point it, if I want REST, I can put in a URL and pull it directly from REST. Or in this case, what I've done is I pointed it at a data set or a data source, which is on my user session right here. So here's my T-client data set. But in 17, because of the terminology, sometimes they're called data source, sometimes they're called data set. But we use a data source to point at a data set, so it connects the two of them. And that's here. And this one is also shared by my 15 page. So let's take a look at the 15 page here. And nothing really fancy here, but this one uses server-side binding. So I have a data set here which points at the data source on the user session. And then I just use a standard binding to bind them. And then I have two events back here. I have the cancel button and the save button, and one just does a post and one does a cancel, and does a release, which will then go back to the 17 form. Okay, let's run the application. Okay, so here I have my application running in Chrome, and you can see if I do the next, it'll navigate through the data, but it does it on the client side. It's not making any server calls. And although I'm connected to a standard Delphi dataset there, in this case a client dataset, what happens is it'll automatically convert it into a JSON REST call. So it actually sent it down to the client as a REST call for a transparently. I didn't have to create any REST endpoints. All I did was connect the 17 data source to the standard data set in Delphi. Now once I have any one of these, if I click this, this is going to execute the server code, which will then open the 15 page. And I have the one that I selected. I have Josh Smith, so I can change him to Josh Jones, and I can change his name to whatever I want to be, or any other changes I need to make, and I can either cancel or save. So let's save it, and when we go back, you'll see we're going to go back to the 17 page, and now it's been changed both on the client and the server side.
Version 17 is being under development since 2018, but schedule has been severely altered by COVID, and we needed to make some adjustments. We added several new major features in 15, and also some of the new features planned to 17 were implemented in IntraWeb 15 as well. Because of the limited session time, we're going to show you some screenshots instead of live demos. So let's have a look at some of these new features available in IntraWeb 15. So let's talk about HTTPC's deployment. The most common ways of deploying an IntraWeb app are as a service, when you use the embedded indie web server, and as ISAPI when you want to execute your app under IIS. Deploying as a service is straightforward. You just need to install the service and execute it. And deploying as ISAPI requires a bit more of work. It's a little bit more complicated. IntraWeb 15 adds HTTPCs as a deployment option, which is way easier to deploy your apps. HTTPCs is a web server that is the foundation of IIS, and it's really fast because it removes all the fat that IIS has. Deploying an IntraWeb app using HTTPCs requires no code change from your side. You just need to modify 2 lines of code in your project file. One of the main points of HTTPCs is that you can have several IntraWeb apps sharing the same IP and the same port, very similar to what you have when you deploy on IIS. This is a bit different when you deploy as a service, because when you deploy as a service, the application takes one of the ports for itself. On HTTPCs, you don't need to install anything because it's already part of the Windows kernel, and it's very simple to deploy as well. You just need to install the application, your IntraWeb application, as a service, and it's my favorite way of deploying apps right now. One of the recent changes that has a huge impact on IntraWeb is the full AJAX support. For those familiar with IntraWeb, you know that we have AJAX even before AJAX was a thing, through partial updates, but our AJAX support had some limitations. IntraWeb will need to render all controls at once, and you could make changes to these controls like changing captions, enabling or disabling some controls, making these controls visible or invisible, etc. But not all controls had Ajax support like our grids and our tree view. And creating a new control required a full page render, which is a little bit inconvenient these days. And for now on, you can create any control using our async events, even full frames. And you have a smoother UI, you have less processing time on the server side because you only create UI blocks on demand, and as a consequence, you end up optimizing data transfer from the server to the browser. Another area that has some enhancements is the async callbacks. Using async callbacks in IntraWeb, you can execute any Delphi code from your IntraWeb app directly from JavaScript. This is exactly what IntraWeb does when you click a button on your page. You have a JavaScript code on the browser side that triggers a particular code on the server side. This is useful when you want to extend what IntraWeb already offers to you. It's very useful when you want to develop your own controls or integrate with any third-party JavaScript library. The example on the screen shows a JavaScript call that will execute the multiply procedure on the server side. And before, we had only one signature on one method signature, and now we have 4 different ones. It gives you more possibilities. For more information on how to use async callbacks, please check our documentation. And we also have some new components that were released on IntraWeb 15. The first one is the IW reCAPTCHA. That's pretty useful when you want to avoid boots on accessing your web pages. Here we have the component being used on some IntraWeb pages. And here we have the component on the designer, so you can view some properties like the secret key and the side key. Here we have the new IntraWeb grids that had support to jQuery grids, including a DataWare version of these grids. Also, we have enhancements on our IW edit control, adding support to native HTML5 input types, as you can see on the screenshot. And Bootstrap support. The Bootstrap support's been around for a while, and it's possible to do that using our template engine. And I'm going to show you some screenshots that were sent by some IntraWeb users, showing how you can have very beautiful user interfaces using Bootstrap integrated with IntraWeb. Here we have another one. Graphs and data tables as well. And we also have the new IntraWeb Certificate Manager. This is a tool that allows you to request and install Let's Encrypt free SSL certificates. You can generate self-signed development SSL certificates with ease. You can also install SSL certificates for HTTP SYS applications on Windows. This tool is free for commercial use, so please have a look at our website for instructions on how to use it. Also, some security enhancements that we have are transparent CSP, transparent cores, and also MAC sessions per IP addresses.
Okay, well, it's back to live question and answer. My name's Ian Barker, Embarcadero MVP. Joining me on the line today is, I hope, Dr. Holger Flick.
Hi, Ian.
Hi, how are you?
Doing fine.
Jolly
Wonderful
good.
weather in Florida, so I'm in a good mood.
You've just made many people listening to this webinar very jealous.
Oh,
it's even raining in Dallas. There you go. And also from A to Z Software, representing IntraWeb, is Chad Hauer. If we just go through some of the questions we've received so far, The main one, I think, was a question about.
Yeah, one of the big questions was with regards to TMS Web Core, is it available for C++? And it's Object Pascal only, because the whole technology is based on the fact that your Pascal source code is being transpiled into JavaScript, and that generates the client web application that runs inside of your web browser. So, and a tool like that does not exist for the C++, so it's Object Pascal only.
Right, and I think the other question as well that came up was to do with whether IntraWeb 17 has been released or not. The question we had was whether IntraWeb 17 had been released. If you just want to quickly go over that.
Okay, no, it's not released yet. Of course, it should have been released by now, but there have been two things that have delayed us. One was we originally planned to put the designer, the what you see is what you get designer, which we showed until 17.1, but after beta testing, we realized that it was just not going to be viable for most people to release it without the full what you see is what you get designer. So that moving that up to 17.0 added at least a year to the schedule. And then 2020 with COVID, fortunately, none of my immediate family has gotten it because we're in a rather isolated place, but our team and within my siblings and so forth, 2020 has been a bad year for us. And we did not get much development done on 17 at all, sadly. We've restarted on 17 in December. We're at an 85% standpoint, and I realize people don't like that answer, and I wish they would, and they all want me to give them a date, but with the way COVID's going, we've had one death in my family, and I just can't give a date. We're 85%. I'm full on it again. We're retasking the team towards it, but with COVID, the world pandemic, I just can't give it a date. But I would hope we have about maybe 6 months of development time left on it. So if we don't see any major delays and we can get through without any more direct impacts from COVID, I would hope that we'll have it by mid next year, 2021.
Right, well, I'm sorry to hear that you've had someone die from COVID. I mean, unfortunately, that's not that uncommon for people, but it's still luckily reasonably rare for us. But, our best wishes for your family there. I hope the ones that are sick, it turns out to be mild and they get better very quickly. And the same goes for...
In addition to that, we've had over a dozen in my family, among immediate family as well. Not where I live here, but in my direct family, we've had over a dozen people. So it's not been a good year at all for anybody.
No. Well, I'm hopeful these vaccines will save the rest of us. And I know if anybody who's listening to this webinar, they may be listening to the replay in the future, and hopefully in the bright future, we've all been vaccinated, or at least the mitigations have made this disease go away. But if you have been impacted, then everybody, I'm sure, I'm speaking on behalf of Embarcadero and the rest of the MVPs and TMS and A to Z as well, I hope you all do well and you stay safe, and that things pick up for us all next year. I think we're all counting on next year, but we've all got our fingers crossed. Okay, so if I just go back to Holger very briefly. For Bruno, unfortunately, we cannot get his audio up because the nature of GoToWebinar is that he's not able to join us in audio. What's the current sort of state of play with the TMS Web Core? What releases are we up to now then?
Well, we recently had a beta announcement of an upcoming release that will have generic support for generics. So as I explained before, the transpiler converts your Pascal code to JavaScript, and there were still some differences between what the Delphi compiler can do in RAD Studio and what our transpiler could do, or I shouldn't say our transpiler, I should say the transpiler that is used in TMS Web Core can do. And now with the new release, we will finally more or less have caught up with generic classes being supported, meaning you will get generic lists, and it will make it even more easy to use your code, that your business logic that you have for existing desktop applications, to run them in your web applications. So the differences between the source code for desktop and web are even becoming less at this stage. And as said, for customers, a beta is already available, and that will be coming early next year.
Oh, so good things coming from both sides. And I have to say, as a MVP and basically as a Delphi programmer who spends his days writing code for money in Delphi, I've used both IntraWeb and I've used TMS Web Core. We're not here to compare the different frameworks. There are some other packages around as well.
Another big thing, Ian, is coming as well. I forgot it initially because it's yeah, exactly. It's always bad if you forget it initially, because the Embarcadero parallel library introduced us to asynchronous programming to make it even easier. And in TMS Web Core, we also have anonymous methods to model asynchronous processes easier, because on the web everything is non-blocking. And with the upcoming release, we're going to get the await keyword. People that use C# know what it does. Basically, you have way more control over your parallel processes this way, because you can wait for them. So that is a big feature as well for working on the web, to make it easier.
Right. Yeah, especially the generics. I mean, that's something that excites me, I think, quite a lot of with the new release of the compiler. So I've actually got a couple of questions. Someone here says, let me see, Ashwin G, I think is your name. He or she says, we have client server apps. Which Webpack is a good start for us? And the reason that they say that is, if I just send this link to your chat windows now, everybody, they're saying, what's a good start for us, TMS, IntraWeb, or UniGui, considering the learning curve? The reason that they mention this Webpack is, and this is kind of a sales pitch, I suppose, for Embarcadero, and I don't work for them, so I expect them to send a check in the post. But right now they have an offer on that. If you go to that link, you'll see that there are options for getting Architect for the price of Enterprise, or 15% off, and a free Webpack. And by Webpack, what they mean is one of the popular frameworks that we've been talking about today, except UniGui, which hasn't been shown today, but it's also another way of webifying your apps. IntraWeb's been around a considerable time and does things its way. TMS Web Core does things a different way and achieves similar objectives in the sense that you're producing web apps. UniGui is very slightly different in that it takes your app that is an app and then webifies that. So it makes that instantiates itself in a browser. In terms of, and I'm going to take the lead here and answer the question about which pack is good for a start for you. The answer is which Webpack is going to solve the solution that you're trying to achieve. If you're looking at IntraWeb, there are certain strengths that IntraWeb might have that are a different approach to Web Core. If you're looking to produce web apps that are, HTML and JavaScript, then maybe Web Core is the thing for you. But if you've got an existing app and you're just trying to make that appear without the changing the code and making it into a true web app, but just make it appear in a browser and instantiate that thing in the browser, then UniGui could be the answer for you. So the answer is it's a bit of a cop out, but there isn't one that's better than the other. They all achieve different objectives in slightly different ways. And we don't want to compare features here because we're trying to emphasize the strengths of the products rather than where one might score points over the other. But it really is a case of what you're trying to do with your client server app, and look at the packages available. A question for Holger, which I think he's answered. Dr. Flick, you said TMS Web Core is a transpiler from Delphi to JavaScript. What JavaScript frameworks are supported, and what is that quote Electron thing? Which that's you probably need to Google Electron and have a look yourself. But
For the
over to you.
latter, it's pretty easy. What is that electron thing? I just completed a video, which I think was published today because of the time difference. You know, we have a 6-hour time difference to Europe, where the headquarters from TMS Software are. I think they published it while I was asleep. I show what the electron thing is. In one word, it allows you to write web applications. So you have a web application which is obviously completely platform independent, but runs inside of a web browser. But with Electron, it gives you the ability to create a binary for Windows, Linux, or macOS, so that your users have a desktop application again, and you still develop a web application. And you have also, as a difference to the big difference to a plain web application, is that you can also access the local resources from the underlying operating system, which is for security reasons normally not possible with web applications. But Electron gives you certain hooks into the underlying machine, and TMS provides very comfortable Delphi components for that to access it. And the video, it's been published today. I just got confirmation for that. It's on the TMS software blog, and it is basically showing you how to convert an existing web application to an Electron desktop application. It's a hands-on example that also shows you how to use one of those operating system specific functionality. And yes, you can use any JavaScript that you want, any framework. You can call it, or you can Delphi has the ASM keyword. Then you can even write like assembler in a desktop application. You can even, the assembler of TMS Web Core is JavaScript. That's how I explain it. And you can even write JavaScript in your Pascal code and mix it. That would even work. TMS provides certain controls for existing JavaScript frameworks or JavaScript controls, but due to the object-oriented nature of TMS Web Core, it is very easy to write your own components and extend the framework that way. And the other thing is that UI frameworks like Bootstrap, which is a lot of people associated with JavaScript, of course, it's a lot of CSS, but Bootstrap, jQuery, you have key integration for those in TMS Web Core, that you can bind any HTML control to controls that you define in your TMS Web Core user interface, and thus you have various ways to integrate modern UI into your web application. And that's something we showed at DelphiCon this year, that you have 3 different approaches to do web design with TMS Web Core. Either you just drop the controls on the form like you're used to from a Delphi desktop applications, then you add a little bit of CSS to that with other JavaScript frameworks. That's the second approach. And the third approach is that you just design your the user controls that you interact with in RAD Studio, and the rest is HTML that you define yourself or let a web designer design, which is the third approach, where you basically rely on professional web design and concentrate on your application development instead.
And Chad, if I could ask you, I mean, when I have written IntraWeb things in the past, I think the key feature for me was the ability to have a standalone IntraWeb app. I think for me that was a very powerful thing, because we were able to deliver an executable that ran as a standalone service. We could click a button and say, okay, now be live, and click another button and say, now be not live. And I think that was kind of a strength for us, one of the reasons why we chose IntraWeb for that particular project. What do you think, from your point of view, would be one of the strengths of IntraWeb?
I think the strength is its absolute maturity and the amount of support we have for it. We have several third parties behind it, so there's third-party controls available for it. We've been expanding the internal libraries even in 15.2, because 17 being, the schedule being adjusted far beyond what we initially expected. We've moved several of the controls down to 15.2. 15.2 has reCAPTCHA, jQuery grids, and several other jQuery controls that have been added natively directly into 15.2. We've added HTTP sys support, so that standalone is very popular, and you can deploy it as a service or a standalone application. That continues to be a big selling point for a lot of people. But really the fact that you develop most like Delphi, you don't have to, if you want to separate it into a REST and a front end, you can. 17 makes it even easier than 15. But by default, if you use the normal pattern that most people develop, it's just like a client-server application. It automatically separates the pieces for you. You don't have to think so much about, well, this is in the front end, this is in the back end, this is on the data tier. You develop it like you would a normal Delphi desktop application, and IntraWeb figures out the pieces for you and does the separation for you. You don't need to go in and manually create the separate tiers.
Yeah, and it does session management as well, which is the other thing that for me was something I think that was a strength that I wanted in that particular application, the standalone nature of it, and the session management, so that we didn't have to worry about, oh, this person logged in and we need some keys and tokens and things like that. I thought it was pretty good. Well, I mean, I doubt most programmers that have been programming in Delphi for more than a couple of years would not know IntraWeb. I think it's one of those things that you know, it's been around for, as you say, a long time, and is mature. In the defense of TMS, I'm not trying to be too conflicting, I suppose is the word, but I think TMS also is you know, doing well. I've used TMS's Web Core for some projects as well, and I think that for me as a developer, I'll use either library depending on what my particular needs are, and I think it's good to have both of you here. I think anybody who's watching this webinar back later, if you've got any further questions, I've put up the contact details on the chat log there. So that if you need to go to the websites, or feel the need to go to the websites and look at some more, you can go to A to Z, which is Chad's company, and see his links. And you can also go to the TMS software link as well, and that's the specific one, I think, for their Web Core product. Like I say, it's horses and courses, but both of them were all together in the same thing, which is using Delphi to produce web apps and writing pure Delphi code, I think, and not having to sully our hands with things like JavaScript. Anyway, we're well over time. I think we've answered everybody's questions. So for now, I'm going to say goodbye to Chad.
Thanks.
And goodbye to Holger.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity, and happy holidays to everybody. See you in the next year.
And I'll say goodbye to everybody as well. Happy holidays, and hopefully, you know, stay safe, stay inside, and look after yourselves. If you're watching the replay, hopefully we're in a bright new future where everything is just a horrible memory. But thanks for attending. We'll speak to you all again in the future. Bye-bye.